Hi, everyone. Welcome to the French Revolution. So, today we are going to talk about the causes and the consequences of the French Revolution. So, let's get at it, shall we? So, first and foremost, we want to ask the question, how did the French Revolution alter society in Europe? What were the lasting effects? This basically sets the stage for democratic movements around the world. And that's because the French Revolution destroyed an entire structure of royal absolutism. It also ended a society that was ordered based on aristocratic privileges. Oh, yeah, it frightened a lot of people. So, why did absolutism make people angry? Well, with Louis XIV in particular, we know he called himself the Sun King. He saw himself as the light, the source of light for all people. Not egotistical at all, right? So, he ends up building himself a home, just a little place he wants to, dress up the drab old hunting lodge of his dad, and he built the Palace of Versailles, what we can go visit today. This very elaborate acres upon acres of just massive amounts of structure. It's ridiculous. Gilded everything. There were three purposes for Versailles. One, it was the personal household of the king. Two, the chief offices of state were there because Louis wanted to move them out of Paris so that he could keep a closer eye on them. And then lastly, powerful subjects came to find favors and offices for themselves at the Palace of Versailles. So, what was the threat to Louis's power that he moved the head of government from Paris to Versailles? Well, some of the highest nobles in the land and royal princes thought that they should have a say in government. And Louis was basically like, nah. So he removes them from royal council. He invites them to the royal court at Versailles, basically to keep an eye on them. And if you get invited by the king, you can't necessarily say no. Now, some other issues with absolutism was basically kept taking power away from local governments. So if Louis was the only one that held control over nationwide policy, then what was the purpose of local governments? His power ultimately limited the local level, like what they could do. So Louis bribed important people in the provinces to see that his policies were carried out. So the people really didn't have a voice. So Louis wished to achieve military glory befitting of the Sun King, and he also wanted to ensure domination of his dynasty over other European affairs because he truly thought that he was the one true king of them all, kind of like the ring from Lord of the Rings, right? One to rule them all. So he developed a standing army of about 400,000 in time of war. He waged wars, four different wars to be specific, between 1667 and 1713. So what does all of this cost? Well, it costs a lot of money. And this money came from taxes and sales and property and tariffs, those taxes on traded goods. He also borrowed money from other countries. There was a surplus at one point in time that they had left over. But in the end, there was a massive deficit. So he was the only one that could create those taxes. Ouch. So there was also this attack on religion. And we see this mainly coming from, Henry VIII and what happened in England. So, in an attempt to keep his own power through religious harmony, Louis started an anti Protestant policy. And his goal was basically to convert Protestants to Catholicism. So, he ordered the destruction of the Huguenot churches and the closure of their schools. And even Huguenot courtiers, those people who are at the court, he forced them to convert or be isolated to their chambers so they could not spread this blasphemous religion of theirs. So The deficit continues to build because, building Versailles and the upkeep in daily life and, just the grandeur cost a lot of money. Louis also expanded the military with a standing army of 400,000. And then by the time Louis XVI comes along, he basically inherits this massive amount of debt that his grandfather and his father would incur, and it doesn't quite go over very well for them. So let's look at taxation for a second. So before we understand taxation, we know that taxing people, right? Now in France, there was the estates, and the first estate was, the Catholic clergy. They were about 1% of the population, and they owned 10% of the land. They received a tithe and paid no taxes. So people who come there pay a tithe. They offer some money. The second estate was about 2% of the population, and they were the nobility, and they owned 25% of the land. They received feudal duties, they paid no taxes, they held higher military and government jobs. And then you had the third estate, which is 97% of the population, and this was literally everybody else: merchants, artisans, peasants, the bourgeoisie, as we call them, and the proletariat. And they owned about 40% of the land, but they had no voice in government whatsoever. And so they were the ones to pay the taxes. The hard-working group is the one paying the taxes, while everybody else is sitting pretty. Ugh, so wrong. So wrong in so many different ways. Once taxes are paid, where those taxes go? Well, first and foremost, they go to the interest on the debt. The next, the military, and the operating costs of the nation, and then lastly, the king and his court. Ugh. So, what do? Do you reduce spending and raise taxes? So the first estate, really, would you benefit from a reduction in government spending? How would you benefit from raising taxes? These are all questions that each estate had to answer. Now, by the end of all of this, the commoners were the ones who got the short end of the stick. They were the ones having to pay all of the taxes. They were the majority of the population, and they owned a majority of the land, but they had to give almost all of their wealth away. So this essentially is what causes the French Revolution. France was one of the richest and most powerful nations in Europe at this time, and the minority in that country held all of the wealth. The working men and women had very few rights. They wanted a better life. So this class system, everyone belonged to one of those three estates. So some of the causes of the French Revolution were, one, those Enlightenment ideas that we did talk about. The American Revolution was a sign of hope that ideas could be put into action, this idea of equality, liberty, and democracy. Then you also had economic failure in France. An increase in population meant a decrease in food and resources, which equaled starvation. You had kings put France in debt, war, their extravagant lifestyle, you had crop failure and bread shortages, and you also had the kings of France supporting the American Revolution. And by the time we get to Louis XVI, he was seen as being a very weak leader. He was extremely indecisive and let his wife, Marie Antoinette, do whatever she wanted. So the people began to resent the king's power, and then everyone wants more of it. So because Louis the 16th was very indecisive, it didn't help that he paid very little attention to his advisors and didn't care a thing about governing. He was seen as being pampered, so he put off dealing with France's problems. And the only solution that was developed, I guess you could say, was to impose taxes. So take a look at this cartoon. What do you notice? What do the different people represent? How did the different groups feel about the Enlightenment? What do you think the artist's opinion of the peasants, the clergy, and the nobles were? So who is Marie Antoinette? Well, first and foremost, she was Austrian, which was France's longtime enemy. But through marriage, there was an alliance that was created. She gave Louis very poor advice. She loved gambling and got the nickname of Madame Deficit. She did not want to wear the fashions of the day. She believed that, or the French nobles believed that insulted many of them. And so it just wasn't very good. So the major events of all of this is first and foremost the Estates General. So this is like their General Assembly was called for the first time in 175 years. The king needed money and wants to tax the other two classes. The first and second estates refuse because they're used to not paying any taxes whatsoever. So the estates were called together to pass new taxes. It was made up of a delegation that represented each estate. So one estate equaled one vote, which meant that most of the time the first and second estates overruled the third. While the third estate refuses the plan, they believe that they should have more say. They want more than just one estate, one vote. They want one man, one vote. Well, the Estates General became deadlocked. So what happens? Well, you have the tennis court oath. So the third estate leaves, is locked out of the estate's general meeting. So they go across the street to a tennis court and they rename themselves the National Assembly and they decide to draw up a new constitution. The third estate arrives at the estates general and they find themselves locked out. So they gathered at a tennis court and they take an oath. They won't disband until a new constitution is written for France. One man, one people, right? So there was a call to revolt. So the king senses danger because of this new constitution, and he orders the first and second estates to join the National Assembly, make them come to their senses. So in 1789, the National Assembly voted to end their privileges. They wrote the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. They called troops to concentrate around Paris. And the people are afraid that the new reforms would not stop the king and that the king would disassemble or dissolve the National Assembly. So that's when you had the storming of the Bastille. And this is the most infamous prison and royal armory. It symbolized the injustices of the monarchy. So a mob surrounds it on July 14th of 1789 and steals the weapons to defend themselves. They overtake the prison and they kill the guards, and a celebration begins, but not for long. This is the first wave of the revolution. Next, you have the Great Fear. So there's rumors that nobles had hired criminals to kill peasants to take property. So this fear turns into violence, and peasants break into houses and rob and destroy the nobles. And then you have a march on Versailles. In October, Parisian women were rioting over the rising prices of bread. Why do you think they would do that? So they broke into the palace of Versailles and demanded Louis and Marie Antoinette return to Paris. Marie Antoinette actually barely escaped from her bedchambers